Right, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get the meeting started, and I will turn it over to our committee chair, Reese Isbell.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Welcome. Thank you for all being here. I think we need to do a roll call, Natalie.
Of course. Reese Isbell,
Here.
Megan Ellis,
Here.
Colette Kavanaugh,
Here.
Allie Mae Pham.
Here.
Hi, welcome, and thank you everyone for the call to order. And we have a quorum. So I'd just like to make a few opening remarks if I can, and then we will move into the agenda. I want to first thank everyone for being here. I want to welcome our newest member, Colette Kavanaugh, onto this committee. Thank you very much for being part of this. And I want to thank previous member Derek Matos for his service last year in 2022. As the Board of Barbering and Cosmetology discussed in 2022, we are hoping that we can enliven our board's standing committees that have been dormant for many years prior. As the board put forward in its strategic plan, the board seeks to utilize existing board subcommittees on a more regular schedule to discuss larger issues and provide more resources for the board to make informed decisions. That was under goal 1. Given the increased attention to the role of committees and the setting of more expansive goals for them, as well as the complications around COVID, there were bound to be some growing pains. I want to acknowledge and apologize to my fellow members, board staff, personnel, and the public for my relatively outspoken commentary at our most recent board meeting regarding the concept of this committee. In those moments at the last board meeting, I began to see that the cancellation of our January meeting, which I had okayed, had been a mistake, and I felt responsible for that. I had been under the impression we did not have any immediate business other than procedural. So at the board meeting, it seemed clear to me that I should have held a meeting, and I apologize to this committee for not doing so. As I have been working over the last year to develop its role and purpose under all of these aforementioned circumstances as its chair, I have been hopeful and passionate about where I believe the committee could be of service to the larger board and to the public. As such, I have put together an agenda for this first meeting of 2023, where I do hope we can collectively come together on what we want the committee's role to be, if and when we can make that happen, while remaining under agreed upon guidelines. Later in today's agenda, when we get to the item to discuss these ideas around our committee's role in more depth, I will have more to say. For now, I'm excited to be here and look forward to hearing everyone's input. Those are my opening remarks. Do we have any further conversation on that, or do we move to the next agenda item? I can't hear anything, but I see that the screen changed to election. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I just wanted to offer if anyone else had any statements, but otherwise we will move to agenda item 3, the election of the committee chairperson. The chairs of each of our committees should be and need to be elected annually at the start of the year. While we didn't have a January meeting, this is our first meeting in 2023. And just to give an example, I joined a committee or a board on the local level in San Francisco a few years ago, and my spot had been the previous vice president's spot, and the board had not had an election and had forgotten how to have elections of their own leadership in over a decade. And so when I stepped in, they needed to have a new vice president, and it was clear that it was important to have annual elections. And while I would like to while I would like to stay in the role as chair of this committee and would welcome the role again, it is fundamental that we continue to provide opportunities for new leadership, new ideas, and new ways of organizing the committee. With that, I'd like to open up the discussion and election of our next committee chair.
Hi, this is Board Member Pham. There is I believe there's a rule in our board member policies that each board member can only serve as chair of one committee. So with that, I am already chair of the Health and Safety Committee. So I think I just wanted to be clear that not everyone is eligible. So I would leave it to the other, and also something for consideration for the other board members. If there's other committees that they feel like they would like to become a chair of going forward in this year, that might be something to keep in mind. And as to regards to this committee, and I'm fine with self-nominations as well. Reese, obviously you've been very passionate about it for this past year, and if you want to continue or are inclined to continue in this role, it sounds like you are. I have no objections to that.
Yeah, this is Sabina. I just wanted to remind everybody, you can't also self-nominate, and you can also nominate anybody you think might be good in the role. Of course, we'll make sure that they accept the role. But you don't have to speak to somebody ahead of time or anything like that. You can always just nominate somebody.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments or nominations?
I'm fine with Reese continuing on as chair. I don't know if I need to just nominate him to continue to do that, but I second that.
Formal nomination would be great. Thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We open this up, correct, to public comment?
That's correct.
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access these features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Okay, do we have any further discussion, or we just go to a roll call? I think we just go to a roll call.
Yes, we can go straight to a roll call.
Okay.
Reese Isbell,
Yes.
Megan Ellis,
Yes.
Colette Kavanaugh,
Yes.
Callie Mae Pham.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to working with all of you in this role throughout the next year. So we move to agenda item 4, which is the discussion and possible approval of our last meeting's minutes, which were in August 15, 2022. We'll need a motion and a second to approve the minutes, or if there are any changes.
If there are no changes, I would like to move to approve the August 15th, 2022 minutes.
I second. I believe we go to public comment now.
That's correct.
All right, this is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access these features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. And we can go to a roll call vote on the motion to approve.
Reese Isbell,
Yes.
Megan Ellis,
Yes.
Colette Kavanaugh,
Yes.
Callie Mae Pham.
Yes.
All right, motion is approved. Thank you very much. We will move to the next agenda item, which is a discussion of our calendar. Christy, would you like to lead us through that?
Sure. So we have included in your packet a list of our legislative and budget committee calendar. We wanted to provide this because we are anticipating some legislation coming. So we will want to stay on top of that. So this committee is planned to meet monthly, at least through the end of the session. And then I wanted to make that note that we will do these virtual. There so far, I have not heard of any plans to continue with our option for virtual meetings. So that may change come July 1. We may lose that ability, which would mean we go back to completely in-person meetings. So we plugged in the board meetings as well on this calendar. But as for that, that's our plan for the year for this committee.
Terrific. Terrific. Any commentary or discussion from members? If not, we can go to public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. And I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access these features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Please. Do we need a motion on this or we just move on?
No, it's a discussion item only.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to item 6. I had asked Christy and committee staff to give us a breakdown of what we had done during our basically our first year and what we had looked at. And I'll turn it over to Christy if she wants to speak to her memo.
Sure. So we provided, as Reese mentioned in the beginning of this meeting, we are just really getting used to having committees. We hadn't had them in the past, consistently at least, and not for many, many years. So we really did a lot with this committee last year in looking at kind of establishing, getting this committee going. So we provided just a little summary. We got kind of a little bit of a later start. We didn't have too much legislation that really impacted us last year, which was, lucky for us because we were still implementing SB 803. So you can see in the memo attached that we show exactly what the committee's discussions were over the meetings that they held. Again, I do anticipate us having some legislation coming this year. So that will impact us more. So I think those conversations will be a little more in depth to what our actual impact is with some pending legislation.
Any thoughts or comments from fellow board members? Thank you, Christy, and everyone for putting this together. I appreciate it. It gives us a good reminder of some of the issues and policies that we discussed last year. And as the California legislature begins a new session, a new 2-year session, it gives us something to look towards with the potential of upcoming legislation that will be in this new 2-year session. I believe we open it up to public comment now.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I have opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access these features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. I believe we can move on to item 7. Great. Item 7, review, discussion, and possible recommendation regarding board member guidelines and procedure manuals, legislative and budget committees purview. As I mentioned at the outset of this meeting, I placed this item on the agenda in order to open up our discussion of our recently renewed board guidelines, which had originally been written in 2006 and have not been updated really since then. Given the newfound growth of the committee and the growing pains therein, I believe it is important to make sure we're all on the same page and following the appropriate guidelines for what the role and purview of the committee is. Before us in the memo in our attachments for item 7 is the language of our committee's purview that exists in the board member guidelines. Up until our last conversation at the board meeting, I had not had concerns with the language, but I do believe particularly I may have had a misunderstanding of some terminology, and I want to clarify that. In particular, I view the term legislative in our committee's title and the term legislation in its paragraph on purview as a bit more expansive than perhaps other interpretations. So I would like to clear up any misunderstanding and make sure we're all working from the same standpoint. I had been comfortable with the current language given my own belief around the definitions of legislation and policy and issues. However, I think we need to look at that. If in the committee's view, and ultimately the board's view, because we are only making a potential recommendation, that this committee's purview be limited only to bills that are already established with a number and language, then I think we need to state that more clearly. If, however, we want to utilize a more expansive definition of those terms, I believe it would be helpful for us to make that clear. My view of the legislative process includes the discussions before a bill is written and given a number. Those initial conversations are vital to the process, and I believe our board and committee loses out on being a full stakeholder in the process if we work only on legislation once it's been written. I would like to point to a few items in our manuals and our newly adopted strategic plan to make a case for a more detailed language to cover the purview. In the same board member guidelines and procedural manual as this committee's purview, under the section on committee agendas generally, it states, among other things, agendas shall focus on the specific tasks assigned by the board and include time for committee members to recommend new areas of study to be brought to the board's attention for possible assignments. I believe the statement in itself puts forward an understanding with its use of the words new areas of study that a committee does not need to be strictly adhered to bills that have already been formalized and sponsored by the legislature. Additionally, in our recently adopted strategic plan under Goal 2 on legislation and regulation, it specifically lists in section 2.1 to review policies and regulations that advocate for and support consumer protection. And in section 2.4, that the board calls for the establishment of a schedule of regular legislative and budget committee meetings to remain current with industry-related issues and policies. In both of these sections of goal number 2 from our strategic plan, the language is more generalized with the use of words policies and issues. Furthermore, I would also like to address the concept around our committee as a whole and that of board members around any potential interactions we may have with legislators, legislative staff, or budget staff. I raise this not because I'm trying to have those conversations per se, but I believe we have some open-ended statements in our documents that need to be more clarified. around what our capabilities are and what are the ethics around that. In particular, under Goal 2 of our strategic plan, Section 2.2, it states the plan to establish relationships with legislators to educate them on industry topics and advance board interests. Again, it's a rather broad statement to topics and interests and not specific to a bill. With all those items brought forward, I would welcome input from everyone on how we might determine if our current purview statement incorporates these above concepts, or if we would like to define ourselves more specifically. And I open it up to the conversation.
Hello, this is Board Member Pham. I do agree that the current language could be clarified a little further, but I am in favor of keeping or our current understanding of what our role is, which is to review current legislation that could affect us in the legislature. So what I'm hearing is there's a suggestion on the table of should we be doing more than that? Should we be kind of generating ideas for legislation, or should we be vetting, legislation further in the process? And my take on it is that actually that is not appropriate to this specific committee. For example, a lot of the types of legislation that the board would want staff to pursue are things that are topic specific. So things that would be appropriate coming from the education committee, our enforcement committee, our health and safety committee. So those committees exist to raise a particular topic, have in-depth discussion from it, and then stemming from that legislation. This committee does not. Suggesting that this committee would be in charge of coming up with legislation makes it sound like this committee stands above the other committees, which is not something that I don't think that the board ever considered. Again, I think that the view has been, or my understanding of it has been, again, making recommendations on legislation. Should the board adopt it? Should it not? Or what position should the board take? Going further than that, again, is like almost replicating the work of the board itself, which is vetting the suggestions from the other committees, which I think is a step too far and probably more than what we have time for in this committee, because then it makes our purview too broad. So I'm in favor of keeping it the way it is, but I do think that the language is a little vague. It is written to say, take on legislation that could potentially. So to be clear, I probably would want to see something to say, when exactly in the process are we looking at legislation. So I'm in favor of clarifying that language to prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future. As to the second point you raised about the question of what kind of contact should board members be having with members of the legislation, my understanding has always been the most appropriate way has been, to direct any conversation to our executive officer. Again, maybe that can be more like clarified, but I think in the interest of carrying a uniform message and making sure that there is no suggestion or appearance of kind of almost, I'm sorry, I don't know the better word for it, but I like ex-party communication, honestly. I really think that the best way to safeguard against all of that would be to make sure that we have one line of communication, that it is what our executive officer says, and as a representation of the entire board, and not necessarily conversations that individual board members, for better or not, maybe the understanding might be a little different from board member to board member. So just to head that off, again, I'd be in favor of continuing my current understanding, which is we should direct all conversation. It'd be great if board members are able to facilitate or at least like kind of get that connection going. But once that channel is opened, it should definitely go through our executive officer. So those are my position on those 2 points. Is one, to continue the current kind of path that we've been going on, which is to review current legislation that could affect us, but to make the language clear that that's what we're doing. And then two, to also make it clear that really all communication with the legislature should go through our executive officer to make sure that our messaging is consistent. Thank you.
Thank you, Callie Mae.
I have a
That's
suggestion to that, Callie Mae, if I may. If you add the word pending in front of the word legislation, that might take care of your concerns and it might make that much more clear. I do have concerns. Each committee we have, what do we have? 4 committees, 3 committees, is to recommend to the full board to help facilitate all the board's work, right? If we add another layer of review, we're making the board's work, it's going to go twice as long, potentially, maybe longer. It's not efficient, and it's not the role of a committee to review other committees' work. It's the board's role, right? And so that's what they're there for. The committees each recommend something to the full board. That's where the final decisions are made. It would be inconsistent with other committees also if we decided to all this, and of course the board would have to agree to review other committees' work or potential ideas for legislative proposals. It seems like you would have to meet for 8 hours every month to try to get through everything, while we have other committees, doing the efficient work to try to get recommendations to the full board. And to your comment about the relationships with legislators, absolutely. That's not a committee role. It's the EO's role, and as well as sometimes if they need the chairperson maybe, or depending on what legislation it is, depending on what, who's meeting where, sometimes the EO may ask the president to come or participate, but that is what the full board does delegate to the executive officer, among many other things. And I see as to the strategic plan 2.4, we have a great meeting schedule already on the books. And then I think I hit it all, but I would suggest just adding the word pending in front of legislation. And that way, like all other committees of other boards in the same role, they review everything pending. They do a recommendation to the full board that really helps the board. It helps make their work a little more efficient, and it makes it quicker also. And it jumpstarts the discussion for these pending legislation. And just like all our other boards, they're really appreciative of the committee's work. And it's very helpful hearing the discussion coming from the committee, including the recommended position.
Thank you, Sabina. I appreciate that. I'd like to speak to a couple of these comments from both of you before we move on to further discussion. On the issue of what comes before the committee, I certainly am not trying to have the committee be a Supreme Court for other committees or what have you. That's not my intention at all. And I do believe each committee has its own jurisdiction and that they should review their own issues. However, I do think that our committee has a role that could assist the board rather than hinder the board. For instance, we had a number of questions at the last board meeting regarding the potential of a interstate compact. And I believed that a number of those questions could have been vetted and understood by the committee before going to the board. And no other committee had really done that. And so it would have been, in my belief, our purview to at least try to prepare the board with an earlier conversation before the board meeting, and trying to vet through those questions that the board members had, and potentially save us time at the board meeting. That was my purview regarding legislation. And given that that was not pending legislation, but create a new idea around legislation, I don't know that pending covers that for me. I would want to have it a little bit more broad in the sense that conversations are being had at the state level, at the staff level, and interstate level around an issue, and we might want to look into it. For instance, if we got into some other kind of interstate compact where staff were interested or the board was interested in having conversations around another type of concept, I think it would be helpful for our committee to review the ideas, the policies around that, the conversations that are being held, not to make any decisions per se, but to have a place for the overall board to have an in more depth conversation. I think that's the point of active subcommittees, are for us to look at things in more depth than the board can get to during its quarterly board meetings, which do not happen as often as the committees meetings can do. And as to the second point, and perhaps we should separate the 2 points, the issue around speaking with legislature, it's not about, I completely agree. It should be staff that has conversations. And potential. My question is more, what potential use might we be if staff wanted us to join a meeting? Or if we have our own relationships with legislators, to what extent are those conversations we have ethically followed? Not necessarily. Just from my own background, I have a great deal of relationships myself with a number of legislators on a personal level and via other policy matters. They know, or at least the ones I've talked to know that I serve on this board. I'm not trying to go to them and put forward ideas or talk to them about that, but I want to clarify the role for those types of conversations whereby if, for instance, a legislator asked me for an opinion, I certainly would turn it over to the staff, but I just want to clarify those ethics guidelines around that. But I think perhaps we need to separate these 2 points because they are somewhat separate. I'd love to hear thoughts from the other board members.
Colette Kavanaugh. I agree with our president about clarifying language. I think I kind of understand it too, hearing both sides of it. Clarifying, like adding, like what Sabina was saying, pending is very helpful, and any sort of clarification in the manuals would be very helpful, even as someone who's new to the board. I kind of like the idea of like discussing stuff that is pending, but in terms of anything that's proposing, I agree that that might be a lot of work and kind of, we have the board meetings and we have the other committees, and it'll be interesting once I sit on the other committees what will be discussed. But this is kind of my interpretation, is hearing both sides, is I like the idea of clarifying the stuff, and it could be broad in some regards, but in terms of doing more per se, like they said, the meetings might get a lot longer and more, into the weeds when we don't really need to get into the weeds. So that's just kind of what I'm hearing so far. That's kind of my opinion.
Thank you very much. Megan, do you have anything to add?
I agree that the addition of the language pending would be very useful. I have concerns about us dipping into sort of a role of oversight in terms of if other committees are bringing forth recommendations to pursue legislation. I don't think that's something that they necessarily need to bring to us first, as if it's permission. I don't think the committees need to do that. I think that the board meetings are the appropriate venue for those sorts of discussions, because this board or this committee really is to review existing and pending legislation. So I think stepping in as sort of an oversight committee for recommendations, I think that puts us too much into the weeds. So I think the addition of the language pending would be helpful, but I do not feel comfortable with the idea of sort of regulating what other committees recommend and that they have to come to us for permission first if they want to pursue legislation. I think that would just encumber our own ability to pursue potential legislation.
Okay, thank you very much for
wanted
that. Yeah, please.
I wanted to clarify something that I left out earlier. Sorry about that. I just saw my notes. I also wanted to clarify that not everything, even pending legislation, not everything has to come to this committee before it goes to the full board. And not everything, even that might affect another committee, has to come through that committee before it goes to the full board. Sometimes there's just not time. Sometimes it's not efficient work. And so, you know, we can't get hung up on like, oh, what if a bill is introduced 5 days or 10 days before the full board meeting, they managed to be able to get it on the agenda, but it didn't come through this committee. That's okay still, because that if we tried to like put it off, we would be then encumbering the full board's work, right? We don't want to do that. Committees are supposed to make it more efficient. But I forgot to clarify that earlier. I just wanted to make sure that everybody here at least was clear that you shouldn't expect every single little minutia to come through because sometimes timing just doesn't work. And also if you start discussing every potential idea that might be legislation or something like that, then that is also part of the board's role. And those great, vibrant discussions are part of the board's role. And that would just bog down this committee, I think, time-wise and work-wise.
Thank you. And I certainly I was seeking to make things more efficient in my understanding of things as well. So I'm certainly not opposed to things being more efficient. And my purview was that the idea of having a committee look at legislation before it went to the board was to save the board's time. But I can understand where the rest of my fellow board members are coming from. And again, I wanted to bring this forward so that we could all be on the same page. And perhaps my viewpoint was a bit more grand than the potential for what this committee might do in respect to the views of the other members of the committee. So I certainly defer to that. I'm not trying to create a new system, although I do have a different interpretation. But if we are able to come to an agreement, which it sounds like we're coming to, around a potential clarification on what our committee role is, then I want to pursue that. I would, however, just remind that that there are often issues that are not legislative bills that are being discussed, potential, future year issues that we're looking at a potential bill in 2026 that would be a larger concept. Not that they would be taking the board's role in having those conversations, but having a place where we could get into more depth regarding why this conversation is being had and bring that concept to the board. But I'm not hearing that interest here at this committee level, so I would defer to the conversation we've been having and thankfully, helpfully make some clarity around what we want this committee to do. I do believe it's also important that we have ongoing regular committee meetings and not just hold them to a standard. If we have a bill to talk about, then we have a committee meeting versus having a committee meeting to update on where we are. I have canceled many meetings and I'm happy to continue to cancel, especially in the fall when there are no legislative activities going on. And we did. Our last meeting was in August. And that was purposeful because the legislature was over basically and we were complete. But I don't want us to get to a place where if we don't have a bill to discuss, we have no discussion. And so I just want to put that out there that I would prefer to have the committee have a role beyond just up and down on a bill with a number. For instance, we had several conversations today that could have been had in January, especially the election and an overview of the year. that I think would have been helpful. That said, do I have any further comment or a motion for potential change or recommendation to the board?
This is Board Member Pham. I would like to move to update the board, or to make a recommendation to update board policy regarding this committee to add the word pending before legislation. I think that's line 2. Do I need to read it? Sabina, do you want me? Okay.
Yeah, there's probably 2 places it could go in, the first sentence and I believe it's.
Okay, he did ask me.
Yeah, go ahead and read it with the updated, just the first couple sentences, the updated
Okay.
word pending.
Okay, so update the policy to state the purpose of the Legislative and Budget Committee is to review and track pending legislation that affects the board. The committee shall make recommendations on what position the board shall take on pending legislation that could potentially affect the operation of the board, the health and safety of consumers, and the board's licensees.
Perfect, thank you.
Do I have a second?
I second.
All right. Thank you very much. I will, before we go to public comment, I would also just, since we've raised the other issue related to legislative relationships, I would like to, and I specifically am actually meeting with members of DCA about those ethical guidelines, just to make sure that I'm following them correctly. And I would suggest that anyone else on this committee or the board that has questions regarding those roles to also have a follow-up meeting with our Department of Consumer Affairs folks around ethics guidelines in conversations with legislators. So with that, I believe we can turn it over to public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And it looks like we have requests for comment from Wendy Cochran. Wendy, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak and a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Well, to Sabina's point, collaborative work with other committees to deal with really critical timing in the legislature, I feel is a very important thing for this committee to keep their eye on. Reese, you made a comment about in the fall, you kind of canceled these meetings because, you know, for whatever reason, but because there's really nothing to do because ledge session is closed. But these really, in the fall, is the time that you're squirreling away those acorns, right? You are making time for planning for the future, because I feel that kind of the temperature is we get hit with these things and there's no preparation. But we all know what these cycles are. We all know that it takes a long time to make these law changes, like what happened in SB 803. And we all know that sunset's coming. Right? That is a constant. That is something you are not going to avoid as an agency under the DCA. So, you know, canceling meetings because there's really nothing to do probably isn't as proactive as this committee could actually be. And I feel that as an esthetician, and knowing that we went through this tremendous effort through California Aesthetic Alliance and through the members of the Facebook group that I moderate, and engaging with the lawmakers on our own, because we can kind of freely do that because we are voting citizens and we are business members in their communities. We've got a lot of things that we need to plan for this industry for the future. We can't just sit and allow licenses to not update and keep in contact with the times. I hear my warning. And keep in contact with the times and progress in the beauty industry. You know, there's a lot of changes that come up really fast on you guys, and you need to be able to predict what's going to go on in the future and not just let it sit there and be the same as 1978. Thank you.
All right. This is a moderator. It appears there are no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. And just as a note, we're not able to respond to public comments, but we welcome them and thank them for speaking out. So I believe we move to a roll call on the motion before us.
Reese Isbell,
Yes.
Megan Ellis,
Yes.
Colette Kavanaugh,
Yes.
Callie Mae Pham.
Yes.
The motion passes. And thank you all for this conversation at the committee level on what our purview is. It does help clarify a great deal, especially for me, on what our committee is interested in doing. And we can make this recommendation to the larger board and also, always revisit and relook at these options as we go through the procedural manual every year for a vote at the board level. So I appreciate the conversation and thank you very much. I think we can move to the next agenda item. This is update and status of pending board legislative proposals. Christy, do we have any updates?
We have kind of an update. There is no bill in print at this time for either items that the board discussed at the last meeting, which was the compact language and the remedial education language. However, it's my understanding there's been interest on both. And so I anticipate this week, actually, I think we will see some language get put into a bill either for one or both of those two ideas. So I would anticipate that at our next month's meeting for this committee, we should have hopefully have two bills to maybe more, you never know, but we should hopefully at least have those two recommendations in a bill.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Any other thoughts on this? Otherwise, we'll go to public comment. I think we can go to public comment.
All right. This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. I'll pause a moment to allow the public time to access these features and submit their requests. All right, and seeing none, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. We can move to the next agenda item, which is public comment on items that are not on the agenda.
All right, and this is the moderator again. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment for items not on the agenda, you can either click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen or use the raise hand function. It looks like we do have a request from Jamie Schrebeck. Jamie, you'll be given 2 minutes to speak and a 15-second warning. Please click the unmute me button when the prompt appears on your device.
Precision Nails, I'll make this brief. I'd like to see more discussion in the future about the budget aspect of the board operations, particularly when we already have existing laws and regulations that require the board to do things that they're not being fully funded for. And perhaps that might be the case based on pending legislation that we're discussing now, particularly with the remedial education. The board needs more funding, and maybe some funds that we already use need to be reallocated in order to meet all of our obligations. Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. There looks like there's no further requests for public comment. Would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. We can move to the next agenda item, number 10, which is suggestions for future agenda items. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add here?
Yes, this is Board Member Pham. I would like to see an update on the budget. More specifically, I see from our last meeting, there was a discussion of a fee study, and the note said that we anticipated finishing it at the beginning of this year. So I'd love to hear an update on where we are with that.
So it's like 50-50.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other ideas people want to put forward? I don't believe we need a motion for that. I think we just put that forward. And if there are no other comments, I will move to public comment.
This is the moderator, and at the direction of the committee, I've opened up the Q&A feature for public comment. Members of the public, if you would like to make a comment on this item, please click the Q&A icon located at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, or use the raise hand function. And seeing no requests for public comment, would you like me to close that Q&A panel?
Yes, please. Thank you. And before we move to item 11, adjournment, I just want to thank everyone for the conversation we had today. It has helped clarify a great deal for me, and I hope for the rest of the committee and the board and the public. So I appreciate taking the time to go through this conversation. And with that, I believe we're adjourned.
Thank you, everyone.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go, after the non-custodial parent, the child